Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Giles Coren and Sue Perkins' show, The Supersizers. This is technically the two different series. There's two series of it, and each of them have slightly different names. There's The Supersizers Go, which is the first series, and then there's The Supersizers Eat, which is the second. There's also a one-off original episode called Edwardian Supersize Me, which was the sort of pilot for the show. The pilot is not as good as the main show. They were sort of figuring out the format, but long story short, the gist of the show is that Giles and Sue go back in time. Basically, they go through these different periods, largely of British history, and they dress in the clothing that people would have worn, and they live in houses that were appropriate for the time. But most importantly, they eat the types of food that people at the time ate. So it is primarily a show about food history, and this is a branch of what we call material culture. So material culture basically is the physical stuff, the artifacts that exist from a particular civilization at a particular time. And food is a major part of material culture, even though it's not generally an artifact that remains. But things like recipe books remain. And they often, in the show, talk about cookbooks from the Form of Cury, which was the first English cookbook produced during the medieval period under the reign of Richard II, up through things like the Queen's Closet Opened, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, up to contemporary, relatively contemporary. The 80s is their most recent time period. Mata Joffrey's Indian Cooking is one of the cookbooks they talk about there. So it really is rooted in the history of food. And one of the things that they do as part of the show is they get sort of medically tested in some way, and then the impact of diet on health is assessed. So, for instance, in the first episode of the first series, The Supersizers Go Wartime, where they go back to World War II, to rationing, etc., etc., they get general health check, and then at the end they discover, because they've been on rationing, because they've been eating a lot of potatoes, a lot of basic root vegetables, not a lot of meat, not a lot of alcohol, not a lot of sugar, they discover that while they've actually gained a little bit of weight, it is muscle weight. Like they are actually healthier, they are more physically fit because of their diet. So this is the other sort of element of the show. But the main thing is the food. The main thing is going back to these different historical periods and experiencing the cuisine. So I'll briefly run you through the list of episodes so you get a sense of the different time periods that they go to. Again, there's Edwardian Supersize Me, the original sort of pilot for the program, which has a bit of a different format from the rest of the show, because again, it was a one-off episode, and they hadn't figured out the way they really were going to approach the series. But then in series 1, you've got The Supersizers Go Wartime, Restoration, Victorian, 70s, Elizabethan, and Regency. In series 2, The Supersizers Eat, you've got the 80s, Medieval, the French Revolution, the Roaring Twenties, the 50s, and Ancient Rome. Then there are also some specials, Giles and Sue's Royal Wedding, and they did a similar thing. It's not necessarily linked directly to the Supersizers franchise, but it is in the same sort of vein with the TV show Good Neighbors, which was a 70s British TV show about a couple in suburbia who decide that they want to become self-sufficient farmers. And Giles and Sue sort of tested whether or not this was practical. But the Supersizers, What's really, really interesting about it is, again, this material culture element, because food pervades our lives, right? Food is a constant element of the human experience. We all need food in order to survive. At the time that I'm filming this, there is famine in the world, or near famine situations in the world, so I'm very conscious of that. But throughout history, food has been central to human culture. It's one of the most important, most pervasive, most interconnecting elements of our existence as a species. And yet fashions in food change over time. And understanding the history of food and the way that people approach eating, what eating means in different ways at different times, is actually a really, really fascinating way to approach history. But also it inflects other studies. The study of social class is really important. It's really, really tied into the history of food. You think about an era like the medieval period, right? There is a huge, huge difference between the massive feasts of the aristocracy, the fish day, the fish fasting of particularly wealthy monasteries and clergy and things like this, where yes, they weren't allowed to eat meat, but they often, I mean, there were obviously poor churches, things like that, but like bishops, cardinals, monks and nuns in wealthy abbeys, priories, whatever it is, they often what we would call feasted on vast quantities of fish and vegetables. But then you had the poor, and the poor were living on bread and like dried root vegetable stews rehydrated with ale and things like this. And so understanding that social class difference in what people ate and how food marked your particular social class, that's really, really important in terms of sort of sociology, social history, understanding things like the role of women, because the role of women in cooking is really interesting and really important, right? Like in the Victorian period, ladies were not supposed to eat much. Like it was not regarded as proper for a woman to eat, or I guess more accurately, to be seen to eat. And yet, in many, many periods throughout history, cooking has been regarded as sort of the domain of the woman, whether even in eras where aristocratic women, wealthy women, were not doing the cooking themselves, like the Elizabethan period, for instance. Nonetheless, they were regarded as in control of the kitchen. In the Restoration period, there's a cookbook that they talk about called, I can't remember what the exact name of it is, but it's meant to be recipes from the household of Oliver Cromwell's wife, Elizabeth. And it's supposed to be a joke, like it's supposed to be a royalist joke. It was written by King Charles II's chef to sort of mock the Puritans with their simplicity and their sort of non-ostentatious eating habits and things like this. But they are the recipes of Cromwell's wife. They are specifically the recipes of the woman. Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, one of the most famous cookbooks, housekeeping books, etc., in British history, obviously associated with a woman, Mrs. Beeton. So the connections of gender and food culture are really important throughout history. It's also important in terms of literature. I mean, you continually have references to food, to eating, to feasting, to sharing meals, whatever it is. And I've actually taught a course, British Literature 1 course, medieval up through around 1798, focused around food and material culture, because you can do it. It makes perfect sense to do it. So in the medieval period, they have a meal based on the Canterbury Tales. They have foods from mentioned specifically by Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales. In the Elizabethan era, Giles has a Shakespearean feast with finely boiled tripe and stinking fish and stuff like this. In the 1920s episode, Sue makes a bouffon d'aube, which is a one-pot beef stew type thing. And it's mentioned in Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. So again, the way that this sort of food and material culture element becomes what the study of material culture is good for is actually a massive range of things. There's so many things you can learn about society, about culture, about the world, and the way that human beings in particular times and places look at the world by examining food culture. It's really, really interesting. And the show, because Giles and Sue are very funny, because it's well researched, because they get professional chefs who come in and sort of comment on what it's like to cook these dishes, you get this really dynamic perspective on the food culture of these different periods. A lot of the assessment of the foods tends to be quite negative, particularly when it's things like eating a sheep's head. Giles and Sue, as modern people, are not that keen on that. There's a lot like the Elizabethan fish day almond custard, which is apparently a very nice almond custard, but there's fish in it. And so that's weird. Like, there are these things that at the time would have been considered quite normal, and people just ate in these particular ways, but we no longer do. And so a lot of it does end up being about contrasts between the way that we in the contemporary West, in the UK, in the US, where dining habits are relatively similar, we eat more than the British, and I'd say we eat less fish than the British, but a lot of we eat less curry than the British as well. That's another difference. But other than that, I think dining habits in the US and the UK are very, very similar. So it feels very familiar to me to have these sort of comparisons made from a modern perspective with how people ate in the Regency or World War II or ancient Rome or whatever it is. And so that I think gives you a useful sort of reference point if you don't know a lot about food history and material culture in the first place. But again, it's a very, very funny show. And so that in itself makes it really worth watching.